Hey everyone, it's Pat and Allie with Seattle Coffee Gear. We're here today because we have been enjoying bringing you some from home roast of the month tasting videos and decided to do a bit of a series on just sort of some basic conversations about different coffee topics. Allie and I have both been working with coffee for a long time and have a lot of thoughts and preferences and can share some information on different kinds of coffee stuff. So we thought we would get started today with a talk about brew methods.
Yeah, brew
Yeah.
method.
Just,
Brew methods are always like my nerdy guilty pleasure when it comes to coffee.
yeah,
Um, I I'm like super obsessed with just trying out all the different ones because I think it's so cool how they can change the flavor and you can get what you want just by using a different style. Like I think that's
totally.
super cool.
Yeah, and I like for me it's like it's flavor the way different methods impart different flavors and
Yeah,
styles, and then also I like the sort of raw chemical and engineering process behind or the brewing of coffee and like the different ways that different stuff does it. Because coffee brewing coffee is often like a very ingenious thing when someone comes up with a
yeah,
new way to brew it. And it's really interesting to see how different brewers and methods are engineered. So yeah,
that's true. I never thought about it that way, like new stuff that's coming to market and
yeah. If you look at like stuff like a fellow duo steeper, which you know it's a weird thing. It's fun to
I know
like it's
a
fun
weird
to
thing.
look at it and go like, how does this work? And I don't use it that often, but it's not because I don't like the coffee in it. It's just because I like to try a bunch of different stuff,
Totally.
and it's interesting, vacuum pots and
Yeah.
aeropresses and all that kind of stuff. So I guess we can sort of start with an overview of what different kinds of brew methods exist. Um, there's
Where should
obviously,
we go?
well, I think the easiest thing to talk about is a lot of times when I write product descriptions for coffee, we talk about this is best for filter brew methods, and that can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And so, sort of broadly, I think, kind of touching on how filter versus pressurized brewing, those are kind of the sort of two of the major archetypes. And then there's some stuff that exists outside of that. But I think filter brewing is probably what people are most familiar with.
Yeah, and that's a good way to describe them too. I never really thought about them broken up that way, but like filter methods, you have like pour over, and that could be like a V60 or a
Hmm.
Molita or a Chemex or, X, Y, and Z. And then there's like the AeroPress could be a filter method, or it could be, like a metal filter method if you go about it that way.
And if you
Man,
look at like, so talking about filter methods, that's generally what we mean by filter methods is when you have a paper filter that is
sure.
going into some kind of basket or dripper or something, and then you're putting hot water through it, whether you're doing that manually with a kettle or if you're doing that in a drip brewer like a Bonavita or a Bravo Precision Brewer, you
Totally.
have a shower head that's like dropping water onto the grounds.
Yeah.
Um, and the what's interesting with filter brew methods is that there's a super wide range of flavors that they can bring out, right? Like
True.
even
Yeah.
just among different pour over drippers.
Yeah. So like you have a Molita, right, in home?
Yes.
Like
Hmm.
yeah. So like I had a Molita style for a long time and then it finally broke. But I used to love the Molita because it's super simple and I don't feel like it requires a lot of effort to do. It's just a very simple like pour over, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then there's like V60, which you can make it pretty simple. And I have a V60 now. That's what I bought it to replace my Molita. Um, but because of the way it's designed, even though it's still using a similar style, like in a paper filter, it has those grooves that rotate. And so that changes the flavor and changes the
Right.
way that pulling or the
Yep.
water's falling through. And so that typically brings out more like floral notes than like a straight Molita, where the Molita might be pretty balanced in
Yeah.
flavor. So that's super interesting.
And I think a lot of people maybe roll their eyes at like how can the water
Yeah.
flowing a different way really change the flavor of the coffee. And it's definitely a thing where for some people you're not gonna notice as much. Like I'm only now starting to kind of catch some of the differences between a Chemex versus a V60 or whatever. And so I think it's when you drink a lot of coffee every day the same way, then you start to go, oh, okay, so there are some subtle differences between this and this other thing.
But you can prepare them very similarly as well. I
Sure,
think
yeah,
if say you gave me a Molita right now to replace my V60, it probably wouldn't make a huge difference. It would be very subtle. Or if I prepared my same coffee in a Chemex, it might be like a little bit lighter in flavor or something like that. But it's just going to be very subtle.
yeah. And I think that's also true of kind of getting back to the engineering thing.
Yeah.
That is extra true. The thing with a pour over is you have so much control over the process, right? Like, yes, the drippers and the filters are sometimes designed differently. A Chemex filter is different than a Molita filter, etc. But you are still the one holding a kettle over the grounds and pouring the water on. Whereas with drip brewers, you kind of are hands off in that process. There's not as much control over it.
Relying on the machine to do it.
Right. And there are some drip brewers like the Precision Brewer that have the ability to kind of change settings for things like blooming and pours and temperature and stuff like that. But like I know I have the drip brewer that I have at home is a Bonavita that just I push the button and then it
Just does it.
I have you can turn on the bloom cycle, which I do, but otherwise it just sort of does it. And so it's down to a lot of the engineering differences don't seem apparent when you just look at it. Like if you look at a Technivorm and a Bonavita, they both have a water tank and they heat up the water, and then the water comes out of shower head and goes through the filter and the coffee into a pot. And so it can sometimes not make sense why you would pick one over the other. But so much of it is like personal preference because the way that the shower heads are designed and the way that it pours the water onto the grounds and the flow rates and things like that are all like all the drip brewers that we sell at Seattle Coffee Gear are gonna be temperature stable at the temperature that you need to brew good coffee. And that's the biggest difference from like a grocery store brand, like cheap drip brewer to the
Like
sort of,
Mr. Coffee.
to the sort of stuff that we sell is that difference in temperature stability. But from there, like there's so much variation in the shower heads and like flow rates and stuff.
Yeah, totally. Like that's so funny when people ask about like price differences and stuff and like coffee pots. It's usually like those really inexpensive ones. Like there's definitely some good ones on the market that are super inexpensive. But like the first coffee pot I bought was literally $10.
Yeah.
And so like a coffee pot you buy that's gonna have all of that temperature stability is gonna make a much better cup of coffee than my little $10 coffee pot I had when I started out.
Yeah. So that's kind of like there's all those filter kinds, and then there's also I usually refer to them as pressurized brew methods that are basically like you're relying on gravity with filters, right? That's all that it's just. I mean, there's some pressure from the weight of the water on the grounds pushing itself through, but you're relying on gravity to just pull the water through the grounds. Pressurized brewing is when you have more tightly packed grounds that a pump is exerting pressure on the water passing through that puck or whatever of grounds. Or I would say that I would call like a mocha pot. Stovetop brewers are also pressure based. They're just, instead of using a pump, they're using the heat of the water to create like the natural chemical process of pushing the water to the grounds.
Yeah, and that's like honestly, the stovetops work the same way as a lot of like heat exchangers and boilers inside of espresso machines. So it's not super far off.
Right. And so that's sort of the other side of the coin, and like there's so many it's so complicated how a lot of that stuff works. Like it doesn't feel complicated when you talk about it all day all the time. It seems like espresso machines kind of feel like fairly simple machines, but when you stop and think, it's like you probably car mechanics think of cars as pretty simple machines, right? When to the rest of us, it's not the case.
Right.
So there's like so much variation and engineering that goes into the way different espresso machines are built and designed and do their thing.
Yeah, and like it's really interesting too. Like, I feel like, do you feel like like, okay, if we're dividing it into these two categories, do you feel? I feel like I started out in all filter methods, so for me that seems like less difficult to get a good cup of coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas pressurized, I feel like can be a little bit more variant
Oh,
because
absolutely.
pressure is a little bit harder to get consistent. You know what I
And
mean?
I think it's so a big part of this that we won't really probably go into tons of detail about today is that all of these different methods require different grind settings
Yeah.
on your grinder and different kinds of grinders. And if you really want to get specific, different burr sets, like Eureka's burr sets for brew, are different burrs than what goes in their espresso grinders.
Yeah.
And you can sort of kind of use a grinder to do everything, but you're not going to get the best results out of it. Like if
Yeah.
looking at Eureka specifically, like if you have Specialita, it's going to produce really good grounds for espresso, but it isn't going to be able to grind for a French press
Yeah. And like
consistently.
honestly, if you think about it, right, like it makes sense. You want
Yeah,
something that's going to be able to focus on what you're doing the most. You don't really, well, unless you do, need like something that's going to be able to do cover that range. But if you're trying to get like the best cup of coffee possible, you want something that's going to be able to do that particular grind well. And like the fines of espresso and like let's say throw Turkish in there too are just going to be so much more specialized than like the
yeah,
general larger coarser range that you can get in like an encore from Barazzo or like the Filtro from Eureka or something like that.
right. And to your point, like from an effort perspective, you are talking about like uh, having to dial in a grind specifically for espresso on your machine. And we get a lot of questions from customers that are like I had a customer just the other day saying like, oh, I'm going to get a Barista Pro. What are some settings I should use? And it's like,
I don't
it's
know.
hard because I don't know what kind of coffee you're going to be putting into it. I don't know the volumes you're going to be brewing at. So like that's definitely a challenge versus pour over is time consuming, but you can kind of learn to do it in about 5 minutes
Yeah.
and then get consistent cups of coffee every time. Like it's not actually difficult to learn how to do it, even though it's a little bit time consuming to do it specifically versus something like a French press where it's if you have a grinder that is appropriate for grinding for French press, all it really is you pour the grounds in, you pour the hot water in, and then you press in a
Right.
little bit, So
Super
yeah,
effortless.
yeah,
I think too that comes at like in the coarser grind like brew methods, it's it's if you think about it, how do I explain this? The coarser grind settings, they have less surface area than that of like the finer grind settings. And so once you start getting finer and finer and finer in your coffee grind, you're getting higher and quicker extraction as well.
yeah.
And so I think that's part of the reason why it just gets kind of more difficult, honestly, as you go up in the fine
Mm-hmm.
category. I feel like that's a good way to like judge it. Like the finer you go, the more difficult it is to get it just
And
right.
it requires more intense control and more
Yeah,
like careful control over what you're doing. So yeah, I think
right.
that's totally right. And I guess we kind of glossed over a little bit, but before we go, we should probably talk briefly about like the kind of flavors you can expect from these
Oh
different
yeah.
brew methods where if you really like super bright and floral and kind of those fruity berry notes and stuff. That's I find it easiest to pull that out in a pour over. Some people might argue that like for fruit notes, an espresso might actually be better, but I generally find that like brighter notes are easier to get in a pour over.
I think brighter notes for sure in like pour over, but sometimes like depending on the coffee and the way that it's roasted, but like in a French press, you can get some really like dense, like jammy notes there.
For sure, yeah.
like, do you remember, like, if you guys haven't seen it, you should go watch it. But there was a roast of the month video we did with a French press and a natural coffee. And I just remember that, like, berry note in it, just like,
Totally.
boom.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that's, another option. You never know. You could always change
No,
it
no,
up.
that's a good point. And I think that's because, you go down the spectrum from the super bright and floral that is easiest to get from a pour over. And then there's the really balanced drip brewers create like a really balanced cup of coffee if it's a good drip brewer.
True.
Um,
Yeah.
and with some of that like earthiness, depending on the coffee, sometimes you really get that from that like diner smoke coffee from drip brewers. But then espresso pressurized brew methods tend to have that like super syrupy, rich,
Yep.
sweet, dark chocolate and kind of flavor. And as widely separate on the spectrum of like coarse to fine as they tend to be, I find when I don't drink French press very often, but when I drink it, it tends to be like a middle ground sort of between the balanced drip brewing and the super rich and sweet syrupiness of an espresso. Like,
French press is such a versatile method too. I
yeah.
think, it, and the reason, so it's really similar to when they cup coffee. Like, if you're familiar with cupping and the way that they like basically taste it when they're roasting it,
Mm-hmm.
it very similar to that experience. And I think that's why it works so well for so many methods. But to me, it's just like so heavy. So I like to do the filter. For me, it's worth a little bit more effort to go
For
with some
sure.
of those methods.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh, I would say I just tend to agree. Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah. And there's definitely like traditional like methods. So like you usually have like a medium to dark roast for your espresso, like a medium to light for like filter methods and stuff like that. But like modern tradition or US tradition, maybe Australia, New Zealand, if you're looking for like the coffee forward, they've been like trying to switch some of that up and try it out differently. But I think there's definitely ones that are like tried and true and then
Totally.
experimental.
Yeah, and I think the best way to go if you're new to espresso brewing, it's best to go with like the blends that roasters say are these are espresso. This is blended for espresso, because that doesn't mean anything. It's the same beans that you. I mean, you can. There's no such thing as an espresso bean, but
Correct.
but that means that they roasted it and blended it in a way to suggest that it'll be good for an espresso machine, and that's probably going to be easier to dial in than some
Yeah.
like super super bright floral single origin. That said, if you go to cafes and you go to a lot of these roasters, like I was at Elm a while back, and they roast very light coffee
Very
there, and they have in their espresso grinders like some of their very light coffee, and it's extremely good because it's very carefully dialed in by
Yeah.
really like by pro baristas that are like super good at it. So if you practice enough, you can make any coffee work
Good.
in different brew methods. So
True.
yeah. uh
Yeah. Totally.
and I think like as a final note, we should say what's your favorite way to drink coffee?
That's such a hard decision. It rotates a lot for me depending upon the season. I go through like I like a shot of espresso, and like right now I think I'm in like an espresso interest, or like that's my
Sure.
like daily go-to. But more often than not, I'm a simple pour over person. Like if I go to a coffee shop, I'll probably order an espresso and a pour over, and like that's my
Yeah.
go-to. Like,
I think for me, if I'm at a coffee shop and I can have someone who's far better than me at preparing coffee prepare it, I like to drink a cappuccino.
nice.
But at home and well, I shouldn't say at home because it's still commercial, but I really like commercial drip brewers, like
Yeah.
batch drip brewers, like
You've
big
got me
Curtis
too.
drip brewers and Fetcos and stuff like that. If I can get coffee from one day, I'll have one of those in my kitchen, and I'll drink coffee from an air pot every day, and I'll drink a gallon of coffee a day, and it'll be very bad. But that would probably be my consistent favorite.
Yeah, the
Um,
one we have in the office is really good. I really like
yeah,
that drip
yeah,
brewer, but it
that's
has like all that programming and stuff.
yeah. I've made myself learn how to use it because I couldn't. I had to be able to make coffee in that thing because it's my favorite. Uh, anyway, we'll be back with more videos like this very soon. Be sure to like and subscribe and to catch them if you enjoyed this one. And we will see you soon.